So, hi there, Liz.
Hi.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk with me today.
Oh, thank you. Nice to meet you too.
And I first heard about you because you kind of approached me through Tabby, I think it was,
Yes.
saying that you had a book about
Mhm.
tarot. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because some people might not have read it yet.
Yeah, sure. So it's called Going Beyond the Little White Book, a contemporary guide to tarot.
Hmm.
And I wrote it because I teach tarot as well, and I've been reading since 2008. And over time, so many people have asked me, how do you learn tarot? Or I would also find that people had been practicing on their own and had been making efforts to learn tarot, but they were trying to take their readings to another level. They would
Hmm.
say, I understand the cards, but I don't know how to put them into my own language, or I don't know what certain cards mean when they come up in a relationship reading, or I don't know what certain cards mean when I'm trying to find out this kind of answer to this type of question.
Hmm.
And so I started to talk to them about the importance of context when we're reading tarot,
Yeah.
right? And as I would have these conversations, I realized that I had all this information in my head, and I thought I should start to write this down,
Uh-huh.
and really just try to give people a guide that takes each card a little bit deeper than what
Mm.
they might find in, the little white book that comes with their tarot decks.
Yeah.
And so I started to put together Going Beyond the Little White Book, which explores, some of the main things that people often come to tarot readers for,
Uh-huh.
such as, career, relationships, sometimes spirituality, but really also looking at cards, not always looking at necessarily how to read reversals, but also looking at, what happens if a certain card comes up as a challenge
Mm.
versus an opportunity.
Yeah.
And what do we do if we have, say, a really great card or a card we typically see as a good omen come up as saying, maybe you need to be aware of this.
Yeah.
So I started to just tie all these examples together, and that's what my book became. So it's a full guide to the tarot. You can use it with any deck. I purposely didn't put any images in
Mhm.
it for that reason. And you get 3 to 4 pages per card,
Mhm.
with all kinds of different information that can help you, whether you're reading for other people, whether you're aspiring to read professionally, or perhaps already do read professionally, but again, just want to dig in a bit more. And
Yeah.
I also put a lot of prompts and personal questions in there as well. If you were just reading for yourself and are really just looking again for another resource that can help you get a bit deeper.
Or hey, even professional readers, it's good to have a new prompt and a new thought about a card working for yourself as well as for your
Totally.
clients. Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because we can get so caught up in sometimes, again, sometimes we get stuck on a loop, right?
Hmm.
You hit a plateau with your own development and your own learning, and you find yourself sometimes starting to see the same things in the cards all the time, but you know that there's something more there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's always good to stay refreshed, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I kind of say sometimes, well, it's good to change decks because when you see the card depicted in a different way, that's one way of kind of giving your mind a bit of a kickstart of like, hey, maybe you should look at it differently. But equally, working through some prompts or reading somebody else's perspective and idea and insight is another way of doing that in a great way.
Mm-hmm.
And you've also kind of touched on something else that I wanted to bring up, and in some ways answered what I was going to say, which is, you put a big focus on reversals in your book. Like someone said that it's almost the same amount on reversals as in like the stand-up card. But I really like what you say about, well, even if you don't use reversals as such, it's about if the card is in the position of a challenge when you expect it to be a nice card, or what do you do if the card is in, the position of it's a wonderful card and it's, the Nine of Swords or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and my own style in terms of reading has evolved so much over time.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a time when I did read reversals. now I don't read reversals so much. There was also a time when I used a lot of positional readings. These days, I really just most often lay a few cards down and let the question drive the reading.
Yeah.
So, I am always evolving in my own practice. And so I don't want to say you have to use reversals or you don't have to use reversals. I just really wanted to keep the whole guide open so that it can be organic, there can be fluidity in it, and people can decide what works for them over time. Because I think that that's also what tarot is about, right? We're constantly
Definitely.
refining our processes with it, and where you're at now in your readings can be completely different 10 years from now.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, in terms of your book, I believe you self-published it, is that right?
Yeah, I did. It's my first self-published book. I've written 6 books, but this is my first venture into self-publishing.
Uh-huh.
So I have a lot of background in writing and media and publishing.
I saw that you've written books on like the punk scene in
Yeah.
Toronto and poetry and even a weird novel. So a lot of different kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. I've been writing longer than I've been reading tarot. I thought that writing was going to be my one and only career. And, I started getting into tarot along the way, just for myself. And, sometimes as our interests do, they become other things, right? And so
Yeah.
tarot eventually kind of started to show up more and more in my life and became a bigger part in my life. And it's not that writing has taken a back seat, but it's really started to integrate itself into my tarot practice, more so. But, yeah, I've been writing for a long time. And, when I started working on this tarot book, I knew that, from my experience, it can take a long time sometimes to get a book published, right?
Yeah.
Depending on, who you're working
Ages.
with, age, yeah, it can, so depending on who you're working with, how long it takes for people to read your manuscript, there can be a very long wait time, even just in hearing back from anyone on whether they want to read your work or want to publish it. And so, as I was working on this book, I thought, well, I don't know if I really want to wait, possibly 2 or 3 years for this to come out, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I have a website, right? I have a tarot business. I'm already, teaching workshops on tarot and things like that. And I knew that there would be people who would, I'd already been having these conversations with, right? People who
Yeah.
were asking me, how do I interpret the cards in a deeper way? So I thought, well, I have people who would want to read this already. So I will just put it out myself and then cut out the middleman, basically. And then there's no waiting. And it's been really great for that because, you have full control over it that way, right? You control when, what your release date is. And yeah, there's less back and forth with it. Self-publishing, might not be for everyone. There can be, a really nice feeling as well in having a manuscript accepted, right?
And having a team, like having editors and people to help design the cover
Absolutely.
and all those kinds of things too.
Yeah.
And help with the distribution and the logistics and the marketing and
Yeah, for sure. So there are pros and cons to both, right? Again, I think because I had some experience with publishing already, I felt confident in putting my own book out there on my own terms finally.
Yeah.
But I think we live in a time when we have the options, right? And there used to be a lot of stigma around self-publishing. And I think a lot of that has fallen away. And there are some really great self-publishing companies that you can work with now. I did mine through lulu.com, and they handle all of the distribution on Amazon and the ISBN number, and if you want, they'll help you with design and stuff as well. So it was a really great experience for that because you're not figuring out all of the logistics, you're not worrying about the printing, or finding a printing house and all of that stuff. That's how it used to be, right? 15, 20 years ago, you would be on your own to figure all of that out. Now we live in a time when we have so many options. So I would say if someone is interested in writing or they have a manuscript that maybe they haven't had any luck in getting out, don't discount the idea of self-publishing. because sometimes, sometimes you could be sitting on a gem,
Yeah.
right? And so it's important just to get your work out anyway.
And it's that thing that, sometimes it's very niche market or something, and publishers may not know how to assess that really, or, it can be very
Exactly.
limited. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what has been the biggest challenge for you with the self publishing?
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, I think one thing is that, with self-publishing, you're not necessarily going to have your book on bookshelves in a lot of stores.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's something that is important to you, you might want to think about that. Now, on the other hand, through traditional publishing, I've had my books on bookshelves in stores. I don't know that it necessarily sells any more copies otherwise, because people have to know that they're looking for your book a lot of the time if they're in a
Yeah.
store, right?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's totally random on whether a browser may or may not pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it can be nice sometimes. Customers, I think, still do like to know that they can go to their local bookstore, actually physically look through a book, read
Yeah.
a few pages on their own first, touch it, feel it, see how big it is, right?
Though, hey, you can kind
So
of read a few pages on the Amazon, preview thing as well.
exactly.
Hey,
Yeah, yeah.
it's horses
So
for
there's that,
courses.
So that's one challenge. You can start to build relationships with some local retailers, but
Mm,
when you start to think about, getting outside of your own city, for example, it becomes completely overwhelming, right? So
yeah.
you won't have that with self-publishing,
Mm-hmm.
so much. But that's really been my only challenge with really with any book, whether you self-publish or you have a traditional publishing deal. It will still be on you to do a lot of the promotion and marketing.
That's something that I've heard a
So
lot. Yeah, I mean, like I
yes.
spoke with someone, Daisy War, about a
Mm-hmm.
month back or so, and she's had, I think, like 30 novels published or something. She's an English writer, and she's just started doing a tarot series. And she said that in terms of marketing, it's really changed from how it was, say, 15, 20 years ago to how it is now, that as the author, you have to do a lot more of the work.
Yeah, that's always been my experience
Mm-hmm.
ever since my first book came out, and I over the years I've learned a lot about promotion. Really,
Mm-hmm.
learned about the importance of finding people to talk to you about your book. Setting up your own events sometimes if you want to go out and maybe do a talk about your book, or book
Signing.
signings and things like that. A lot of the
Yeah.
times authors are setting those things up on their own,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have to figure out how do you get people to come to these events.
Yeah.
um, how do you, if you want to go on tour, a lot of the times authors set those things up on themselves too. So if you want to get into other cities, it's a lot, right? So
Yeah.
you have to be very strategic about what's a good return on investment in terms of your time.
Mm-hmm.
If you have, any budget that you want to spend to help promote your book, all of those things have to really be weighed in. No matter what kind of publishing
Yeah.
avenue you're going down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, have you found any sort of different challenges with bringing out a tarot book? Because I mean, I guess there's quite different markets that you're looking at, though. Having
Mm-hmm.
said that, like the markets that you've gone to have all been in some ways quite niche. I mean, poetry and Toronto punk and tarot, none of these are exactly like New York Times bestseller list material,
No,
really.
no. I'm not really working within a very commercial realm
Yeah.
in that way. My punk book, it's interesting. Nonfiction, I find it's much easier, I think, to move forward with. It tends to have a longer, not no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, shelf life than
Yeah.
than poetry or fiction does a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
time. My book on Toronto punk, it was my first book. I was 24 when I started writing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very young. I was working as a freelance journalist at the time, but I didn't really have a big presence in any way. I hadn't established anything for myself. So no one really knew me in publishing or anything like that. But that
Yeah.
book, no one else had done a book on that subject before. So I
Mm-hmm.
was the first person to break into that. And that gave that book a longevity.
Yeah.
So people still read it. You can still purchase it. It's still in print.
Uh-huh.
And people still talk about it. And so when you do something nonfiction, like similar with a tarot book, it becomes part of a canon.
Mm.
Right? There's a long-standing community of people who are interested in tarot, who've been doing it for a long time. And it's also something that a lot of younger people are now coming into as well. So people are looking for books on tarot, right? Yeah. Poetry is the most challenging, I think. No one is looking for books on poetry. So,
yet you've done quite a few.
Yeah. So I think, if you're working within a creative capacity as a writer, doing fiction or poetry or something like that is actually the hardest to sell, over anything else, because it's very hard to find, to sometimes find your readers within that kind of work.
Yeah.
And there isn't also the same kind of community that is built up around, say, tarot or even, astrology, witchcraft, any of those things, right? Like, again, people, there's a long tradition of an oral history with all of those practices where people are all sharing information with each other.
Yeah.
It's not unusual for someone to write a book about tarot, right? And for other people to say, oh, I'm so interested. Exactly.
I mean, one of my favorite books is still Rachel Pollack's 78 Degrees of Wisdom back from the 1970s. Right. So, hey.
Yes. And, and that book is still talked about, right? Yeah. I hear that book referenced all the time in tarot, all the time, right? So that's the other thing. And that's something too, if anyone's listening to this and they are thinking of perhaps, putting out a book on tarot, or a similar subject, and they're considering self-publishing. One thing about self-publishing is that you have full control over your work in that way. So if you want it to stay in print forever, it can stay in print forever. It's not in the hands of a publisher that may go out of business one day or might decide to close its doors because the owner is retiring, and so they retire all of their work with it, right? You really retain all the rights, so that can be a great thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You also said something about that your writing has become more integrated into your tarot practice. Is that just in terms of the book going beyond the little white book, or is there something more to that?
Well, I do a lot of blogging. Every week I send out an astrological update just to look at what are the energies that are coming up for the week ahead. And I always pull a tarot card to go along with that. And I've been doing those updates for, I think, about 3 years now, every Monday. And, and I just love writing those, right? Like it seems like a lot to do, say, a weekly update, but I just get a lot of enjoyment out of talking about those things. And the more I find I write about tarot or astrology, or even just share personal spiritual practices in that way, the more inspired I get and the more ideas seem to flow from every time I sit down to write about those things. So, I'm feeling, as though, for a while I felt like I kind of had two different things, and I was like, well, how do I hold on to my career as a writer, and how do I also hold on to my work as a tarot reader? And now I'm realizing they're just actually commingling constantly. So, yeah.
You've also mentioned astrology quite a few times. Is that something that you do? Well, you said you kind of do an astrological update and you also pull a tarot card. So it sounds like you combine the two quite a lot.
I do, yeah. I do astrology in my private practice too. So I do natal charts for people, or year ahead readings to look at upcoming transits and things like that. And I find that tarot and astrology are very similar. And sometimes, sometimes I find that I'll be working with clients for a longer period of time, and they'll come to me for a few tarot readings, and then they'll, through that process, they become interested in perhaps having a chart done. Yeah. So when we finally get into their chart, we'll find that everything that is coming up in their chart has already been coming up in their tarot readings leading up to that, right? So I find that the two of them speak to a lot of the same themes, and it makes sense, right? Tarot is very much integrated with the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, just like the wheel of the zodiac. So, they're pulling from those same energies. And I think any divination tool is going to be able to speak to, things like your path and purpose and where you're at right now and what kind of challenges or themes you are moving through at the time, which is just what astrology does too.
Yeah.
And it can be a really nice way to layer in some extra messages or questions that someone might have, if they're looking at their chart. Maybe they are in a difficult transit, or they have some challenging aspects in their natal chart, and they might be aware of what those are, but they're not sure how to break away from those patterns or those ways of thinking. You can actually start to build a deeper reading with tarot through that by saying, okay, well, let's see what the cards have to say. What are some next steps, right? Some immediate actions that we can get from the tarot that can help you actually think about, okay, what can I do right now after I leave this reading? What can I start doing? So it can be nice.
And with that, I mean, it really sounds like you're describing the way you read, which sort of matches your catchline on your website of, seize the future with your tarot readings, which I loved.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I like that too. We often think about tarot as, as a way to see the future, right? And, there's been a lot of shift, I think, away from looking at tarot as a strictly predictive tool. But for a lot of people who are new to these things, right, especially people who are seeking out readings, they're not always aware of the conversations that are happening within tarot communities, right, or people who are very seasoned in this kind of work, or who are seasoned clients even, and so I think it's important to let people know that once you start getting readings, that you're probably actually changing your future more than seeing your future, right? So I think I like that idea of seizing it rather than seeing it, because it's much more active rather than reactive and thinking that things are just going to happen to you and you just have to go with it.
But and how do you find that clients respond to that? Because I mean, I worked on a tarot hotline for a while, and it was like the clients, not all of them, but there was a good chunk where what they wanted was just that straight up prediction. So do you get that sometimes with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I hear you on that. I worked for a hotline very briefly at one time. And yeah, I found that too. And, I often tell people, I don't get a lot of people who are looking for that. I think because I'm very clear in what I'm offering through my readings. But I do work at a shop on Sundays, here in Toronto. And so it's mostly walk-in business. So I don't always know who's coming, right?
It's always a surprise know who they're going to see.
Exactly. And they might not know me. So, so sometimes I will get people who think that tarot is just going to tell them how, everything that's going to happen to them from now until, the last day of their lives. And I say, nothing is written in stone, right? Nothing is written in stone. There is no true certainty in life, right? We can kind of figure out, the direction of where things are going based off of where we're at right now. But I don't actually know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? And if I did, I don't know, would I be reading tarot? I mean, I'd probably be working for the FBI or something, right? Like this is, we have to think about, about this idea of, individuals being able to see, see so far into the future, detail by detail, and how realistic that actually is. And so I do challenge people sometimes on those assumptions in that way, because I also don't believe that we're meant to know everything.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Or that we can even accept everything. Like sometimes you see things in the cards and you just don't want to see it, or perhaps you do a reading and you look back on it 2 years later and you're like, yeah, it was right there, but I didn't want to see it at the time. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
You've mentioned about your sort of practice changing over time, that you used to read more reversals now, and then with spread positions, and now that you just kind of throw the cards down. That sounds like what a lot of people these days are doing with the Marseille deck. So has the deck that you prefer changed, and what is your current favorite?
Oh, I love this question. I've been using this mainly the same deck since day one, which is the Charmin Caselli Tarot.
Uh-huh.
And it's I think it's a very beautiful deck. It's it's an updated Rider Waite, so
Yeah.
they redid the artwork. But it's very, it also, I often find most of the cards in the deck stay very true to the Rider Waite
Yeah.
as well. And that was really my first, I learned the Rider Waite system
Yeah.
first, but I have, been studying Tarot of Marseille, and that was a big turning point in my own style of reading, because Tarot of Marseille is such a literal way of looking at the cards.
Mm-hmm.
And it really helps us to, it pushes us to look at what are the cards just actually doing.
Yeah.
And once I started studying Tarot of Marseille, and really going back in time, in terms of learning, how did people read cards before the Rider Waite came along?
Mm-hmm.
That really helped me to shift and evolve in my own style, and move past positional readings and stop relying on those so much, because Tarot of Marseille is very much just about letting the question drive the reading, and just throwing some cards down and seeing what's there and seeing what you're really working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you still use the Charmin Caselli, even though you use it in a more Marseille style reading.
You got it. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. And I really I integrate everything, right? I still have, I still rely on, all of those meanings of the cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
That have built up over time, all the different ways I've seen those cards speak to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, learning Tarot of Marseille really helped me, to almost see the cards in terms of the movements that they make, and to understand their body language, and to understand how they truly speak to each other, and pick out all kinds of other patterns in them that I hadn't noticed before.
Yeah.
So it's the same deck, but it made me really see a whole other layer of the deck that I hadn't noticed before.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Lovely.
Yeah.
You also mentioned something about witchcraft. Is that something that you're involved with?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I think for all intents and purposes, I would say that that's a big part of my spiritual path. Again, I rely so much on the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, right? All of these things that we need to survive, all of these things that we find in nature. I spend a lot of time in nature where I live right now. We overlook a big valley here, so it's very beautiful, and it's kind of like this, this amazing wild backyard that we have, from our 16th floor apartment. And when I think about witchcraft, like I think about the word craft, right? That we craft tools and inspiration and intentions from the world around us.
Yeah.
And that's really what the basis of that path is for me, is to constantly be in communication with nature, to be honoring the change in seasons, to understand the energies that we're moving through astrologically, and how all of these things impact us, and how we have to pay attention to them in order to better understand our energy levels, our decisions, things that we're trying to make happen. So important.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah. Well, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Liz.
Oh,
really
thank
great.
you. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It was so nice to talk to you.
Yeah.